What killed the Roman Republic? This is sort of the first of the 3 lectures in which we're going to talk about what happened to the Rome, ancient Rome. This one's about the Roman Republic. The next is going to be about the Roman Empire. And the third is going to talk about Christianity. So we're beginning with what killed the Roman Republic as our question. That presupposes that you know that the Roman Republic does eventually fall and is replaced by the Roman Empire. Okay, Roman Republic, 509 to 44 BCE. You'll notice that we're moving down to that year 0 here. It lasts for a fair amount of time. To be honest, though, that 509 date, that's probably more mythological than necessarily completely accurate. That's the number that was always used by the Roman historians. Modern historians are a little bit more dubious about it. You'll notice, too, that when we talk about the Roman Republic, it's an area that is going under enormous growth. And so if you look, there's that little red dot in Italy. That's Rome itself. At the beginning of the Republic, around 500 BCE, that's that little dot. That's what Rome means. Over the next 200 or so years, it gets to the purple, so basically all of Italy. And then, of course, it expands to include the orange, Spain, a little bit of North Africa, Illyria, basically, I guess what we'd call southeastern Europe at this point. And then, of course, later on, with by the death of Caesar, you've got it to include much larger areas of North Africa, some of Europe, and other areas around the Mediterranean. So it's growing pretty dramatically over this period of time. At the heart of the Roman Republic is the Roman family, sort of like we've talked about in a lot of these different societies. The central institution of the Roman family was the paterfamilias, the father of the family, who held the patria potestas, which is the power of the father. And one thing you have to keep in mind here is when we say paterfamilias, we don't mean just dad or your father. What we mean by that is the father of the family is the head of the family. And so it's the oldest male who's in the line of power, basically. So it might be your grandfather, it might be your uncle, it might be your actual father. But it's that oldest male who holds that power. And you can sort of, that sculpture right there, that's an example of a Roman portrait of a Republican paterfamilias. You'll notice in Roman sculpture, unlike Greek sculpture, there was a large emphasis placed on being accurate. And, people wanted to be shown as they were, and they wanted to be shown as serious and responsible and respectable and all of that kind of stuff. And so you look at this guy and you think, that is an old guy. That is a sober man. Probably not the easiest guy to deal with. And that's pretty much what you're supposed to get out of him. The patria potesta meant that the father of the family, the paterfamilias, controlled the property of the family. All of that was his control. He controlled his sons or other male descendants, whether it be nephews or grandsons or whatever. You were not a full adult legally. Remember, we talk now about being a minor, where you're a minor in terms of sex until one age, and you're a minor in terms of alcohol until 21, and you're a minor in terms of voting until 18, all these different ages. Well, for the Romans, it's really simple. You are a minor until either your paterfamilias dies, okay? And in some cases, that even doesn't do it, because if you're a grandson, your paterfamilias dies, you may still be under the control of your father. Or they give you the power to be free. So you technically do not own property yourself. Your property is owned by your paterfamilias. Technically, you cannot make contracts unless your paterfamilias gives you approval to. You cannot get married unless your paterfamilias gives you permission to. And he can try to marry you off as well. And so to put this in perspective, if you're really unlucky, you could be a 50-year-old man and you could still be a minor because your paterfamilias is still holding on, is still around. So basically gaining legal adulthood for a male means being the head of the household. And that's something that most men aren't in these situations. Of course, this really counts more for the men who have money to inherit. If you're a poor family in the middle of the slums of Rome, your level of concern about whether or not your father approves of you is going to be a lot less. And you're much more likely in that case to say, forget you, I'm going off and doing my own thing. But if your inheritance depends on your paterfamilias approving of you, then you're really held by this. It's very hard to get around it. Women are always supposed to be under the control of someone. Women are supposed to move from their father's authority to their husband. If their marriage falls apart, they're supposed to move back to their father's authority. They are always supposed to have a legal guardian. They are never supposed to be independent. An ideal woman, according to Romans, would be a good matron, married woman and mother who's at home doing her weaving, which is always a good thing for a woman to be doing historically. One of the most important things women do is they create cloth. So she'd be at home doing her weaving with her daughters and her servants or slaves. However, we've got some pretty clear evidence that a lot of Roman women went off and did a bunch of other things. They attended games, they went to religious celebrations, they went out to eat, they took lovers, they got up to all kinds of stuff. But theoretically, a good woman is supposed to be at home weaving. Practical terms, once again, a lot of it has to do with the wealth of your family. If you're a well-off family, that works. If you are a widow or a wife whose husband took off, or simply a very poor family, on the other hand, you might well have a business. You might keep a tavern. You might keep a restaurant. You might do a whole bunch of different ways of earning a living because, once again, staying within the household only works if the family has enough money to make that possible. The ultimate form of the power of the paterfamilias is seen in the power of life and death. Technically, a father has the power to have his children executed. Very, very seldom ever happen. But the place where it did happen, in a sense, would be with infants. Shortly after birth, an infant is supposed to be taken in front of the paterfamilias who has a choice. They can accept that infant into the family, or they can reject that infant. If the infant is rejected, the infant would then be exposed, left out on a street corner, in a field, somewhere. There's lots of Roman myths, like there's lots of Greek myths, similar systems, similar practice, similar myths, about what would happen to those infants. And so one famous one for Rome would be what we're seeing here is Romulus and Remus, who were exposed as infants, but then this kindly she-wolf takes them in and feeds them. That's what they're doing here. They're nursing from the she-wolf and raises them. Practical terms, probably not a lot of them were raised by wolves, but some of them probably were picked up by families who didn't have kids and wanted to adopt a child. Some of them were probably picked up by slave traders who saw it as a long-term investment. And some of them undoubtedly did not make it. Historians suggest that probably if you were, one of the reasons a father might choose to expose the child would be if they had a visible disability at birth. And in that case, I would be willing to bet your chances of getting adopted or taken in is going to be a lot less than a not disabled child. Other reasons might be it's not the father's child, it's not the husband's child, it's the slave's child. The father, or at least the husband, suspects this. Maybe the family's in an economic crisis, they can't afford to take care of another child. Possibly, maybe because of the gender of the child. There could be a range of reasons. But most infants weren't exposed. One other component of the family, the lares and penates, and we actually know very little about them, but they were family shrines, family worship, and it's the kind of thing that you learned how to do from your family, and so nobody ever really wrote about it. This is a family altar in Pompeii. That's the city where Everybody died of the volcano exploded, everybody died of the gases first, and then the ash came down and preserved the city. So it's the best ruins we've got for ancient Rome, ancient Roman society. Possibly family spirits, possibly family ancestors, we really don't know. Republican politics and government. Just some very general stuff here. Supposedly the founding of Rome starts with this overthrow of the kings. And the myth goes that the Romans were ruled over by the Etruscans, the Etruscan king, which is a nearby city. And they ruled over the Romans, and they weren't very nice about it. And supposedly there was a Prince Tarquin, who was the son of the king. And Prince Tarquin falls in love with, or at least in lust with, Lucretia. And Lucretia was a good woman. She was the wife of a noble, a patrician man, Roman man, Brutus. And she was a very beautiful woman, but she was also a very good woman, a very good wife. Well, Tarquin wants to sleep with her, but he knows that Lucretia is not going to do that by choice. And so he sets up a situation. He makes sure that Brutus and Lucretia's father and all their other male relatives are going to be off fighting. And then he comes to Brutus's house, and Lucretia sees him there, and she, of course, has to take him in and show good hospitality because he's the prince and he's a guest. And she gives him dinner, and then she gives him a room where he's going to sleep for the night. But he sneaks out of his room in the middle of the night, breaks into her room, and rapes her, and then takes off. And she, of course, sends a message to her husband and her father and all their other men, and they come back, and she tells them what has happened. And I'm going to read a little bit from the Roman poet Livy's version of what happened here. They seek to comfort her, sick at heart as she is, by diverting blame from her who is forced to the doer of the wrong. They tell her it's the mind that sins, not the body, and that where purpose has been wanting, there is no guilt. In other words, he forced her, she didn't want to do it, therefore she hasn't been unfaithful. She hasn't been unfaithful to her marriage. It is for you to determine, she answers, what is due to him. For my own part, though I acquit myself of the sin, I do not absolve myself from punishment. Nor in time to come shall unchaste women live through the example of Lucretia. In other words, no one in the future is going to be able to say that, hey, who was committing adultery would be able to say that, hey, no, I was raped, and sort of justify themselves by her example. And so she takes out a knife which she had concealed beneath her dress. She plunged it into her heart, and sinking forward from the wound, died as she fell. The wail for the dead was raised by her husband and her father. Brutus, while the others were absorbed in grief, drew out the knife from Lucretia's wound, and holding it up, dripping with gore, exclaimed, By this blood most chaste until a prince wronged it, I swear and I take you gods to witness that I will pursue Lucius Tarquinius Superbus and his wicked wife and all his children, with sword and with fire, I with whatsoever violence I may, and that I will suffer neither them nor any other to be the king in Rome. And so Brutus leads a rebellion. They throw out the evil Etruscan kings, and after that, Rome supposedly is a republic. It's a founding myth. It actually probably tells you as much as anything about ideas about thinking about women. But that's supposedly the beginning of the Roman Republic. And going with that myth is the belief that there should never ever be another king, which is going to be a little bit of a problem when the emperors are trying to set themselves up. Underlying tensions within Rome, it's the Roman Republic. First of all, is this what they call the struggle of the orders. And that's because there are two types of Romans. There are patricians, that's the elite, that's about 10% of the population, who control most of the money, the wealth, and the political power. And they're the ones who can have political offices. You have to be a patrician in order to be a part of the Senate. You have to be a patrician to be a consul, which is another high office. You know, any of these high positions, you've got to actually be a patrician to hold them. You need to be a patrician to be an officer in the army. Then there's about 90% of the population, which are the plebeians. And they have a lot less of the wealth. They have a lot less of the political power. And their political office, the one that they can do, is the tribunes. And those are the ones that they vote for. That disproportionate power between the two groups, where the majority has less power than the minority, creates this ongoing tension that's just not going to go away. Theoretically, it's dealt with through the patron-client relationship, and that's where, we use patron today often. We either talk about like patrons of a restaurant, or we use it as an insult. He was very patronizing to me. In this case, you're supposed to be patronizing. It's seen as a good thing. And what that means is let's say you're a poor plebeian peasant. You know you're going to need some help. You've got some problems that you know are going to end up in court, or might end up you're going to be affected by some laws by the Senate, or whatever reason. You're going to need some help. And so you go to your local plebeian and you ask him for help, and you give him a lot of compliments. You maybe give him some gifts, but more than that, he agrees to look after you, and he will represent you before the Senate, or he will talk for you in court. He will stand up for you. And in exchange for that, you're supposed to give him your loyalty, your political support, and also you're supposed to be visibly loyal. So, for example, let's say you have to visit Rome for whatever reason. Well, when you're in Rome, you have to go. Each patron would hold sort of visiting days where all of their clients are supposed to show up. So you show up and you'd like wait outside your patron's home until they have space to let you in. And that's a way that everybody who would go around, traveling around in Rome could look and say, oh, wow, Decimus, he's a really important guy. Look at all those clients that are waiting outside. And so you're supposed to support them. And in exchange, they're supposed to help you out. That's a way to try to share power, but it's not a fully satisfactory way. One other notable thing about the Roman Republic, and one thing that the Romans were very proud of, they had written laws passed by the Senate. And so it's not oral traditions, an actual written legal code. Another sense of tensions come from the ongoing conquests, and just that map shows you once again how those conquests are spreading. First element of that is the switch from soldier farmers to professional soldiers. And obviously this is not a picture of a real Roman legion. This is a picture of recreationists who are dressing up to act like Roman legions. Historically, the way it began was, if you were a citizen of Rome, you would fight as a soldier, and it was an honor because non-citizens weren't allowed to fight. You wouldn't even get paid for it. So most of the time you're a peasant, maybe a small farmer, you have your farm, you farm on your farm. However, when it comes time for war, you get together, you go fight, and then when it's done, you go back to your farm and you sort of catch up. And usually wars would be held on the off season. You're not doing anything. It's winter, so you've got time to go off and fight, and then you'll get back for the spring planting. However, as the empire expands, you've got to go further and further and further away from home. And these wars take longer. And the travel time adds up. And so you really can't do that. You can't go fight a war in the winter and get back for the spring planting. What that means is a lot of times you're going to lose your farm because you've left your wife, you've left your children behind, and they're trying to manage without you, and a lot of times they can't. They go into debt, they can't keep up with their payments of the debts, they can't pay their taxes, they can't do what they need to do to keep the farm going, and so they lose their land. That land then often gets bought because you have patricians who are doing very, very well. Often, one of the ways that they do this is because all of those new lands that get conquered, somebody's got to go out and be the administrator there, the people who run the government. And that's the kind of job that you give, if you were a senator, you give to your brother or your nephew or your son. You lobby for them to get those kinds of jobs. Or if it's the top position, maybe you as a senator get that job. And you can get rich from those because there's your salary. You get a portion of whatever you do, you take bribes. There's a whole variety of ways where you get rich. You take that money and you invest it. You buy that land that is going up for sale. And you get what are called latifundia. It's basically a really large farm, an estate. And then to work on that land, the other thing you invest your money in is you buy slaves. And there are lots of cheap slaves available because every time you conquer a people, there's prisoners of war, There's people who get captured, and what do you do with those? You sell them in the slave market, which means that there's an ongoing, constant incoming number of slaves who are relatively keeping the price of slaves fairly cheap. So you can afford to have your latifundia and have your slaves working on your latifundia if you're a member of the elite, and can do quite well. And so that latifundia is replacing that small farm that was farmed by the people who actually lived there, who had owned the land. Slavery in itself is a huge part of Roman society. It's widely accepted, and nobody really is anti-slavery. Maybe individual slaves themselves, though there are plenty of former slaves who get their freedom. They're given it in their master's will, their mistress's will. Maybe they were a particularly good particularly good slave, who then go out and buy slaves themselves once they're no longer slaves. And there are people who talk about how you should treat your slaves well. And there are people who talk about how certain groups of people shouldn't be turned into slaves. There's really nobody out there critiquing slavery itself and saying slavery in itself is wrong. And just to give you an example of this is from Ephesians. Slaves, be obedient to the men who are called your masters in this world with deep respect and sincere loyalty as you are obedient to Christ. Not only when you are under their eye, as if you had only to please men, but because you are slaves of Christ, and wholeheartedly do the will of God. Ephesians, written about 90 CE. So, criticism of how you treat slaves, not criticism of slavery. There's a common belief that the people who end up being slaves are well suited for slavery. Frequently it's alleged. And servile means slave-like. The idea is that you know that you're suited for slavery because they're basically losers. You end up as a slave because you lost the war and you're a prisoner of war. Because you went so far into debt that you couldn't pay your debts, and so they seized you and they sold you as a slave to pay your debts. Or you were sold into slavery by your father because he couldn't pay off his debts. In other words, in some way, you failed, and that's how you've ended up being a slave. Because there were so many slaves, there's a real fear of revolt, and that played out in sort of local levels, like, for example, if one slave is accused, if your owner dies of murder, every slave that he owns is going to be executed in the household, because the assumption is either you helped, you conspired, or you failed to prevent it from happening. So you better hope to goodness that your master does not get poisoned, because it may not be your fault, or even that he gets sick and it looks like poisoning. You're going to be executed just the same. But then there's also the fear of revolt on the large scale. And the best example of that is Spartacus, and you guys are maybe familiar from his name. There's TV shows, there's been previous TV shows and movies. Really large slave revolts, there's others, in which 60,000 slaves revolted. It was put down by the Romans, put down hard, and 6,000 of the revolting slaves were executed. They were crucified, which, remember, crucifixion, it's basically, historically, it was seen as a very horrifying, painful punishment. Among other things, it takes a while for people who are crucified to die. And so the point of that was they were crucified, and the crosses were set up next to the roads, the Roman roads. And so you would be traveling down that road, and you would see either the people dying next to the road or their corpses, which were left there to hang for quite a while. And the idea is that you're going to look at that and you're going to say, no, I don't want to participate in a revolt if you're a slave. Okay, so these underlying tensions, the tensions between the plebeians and the patricians, the problems of trying to figure out how to cope with this ever-growing empire, how to manage it, the issue of the growing number of small farmers and peasants who are losing their lands. All of those things are going to play into the tensions that are going to lead to the fall of the Republic and the rise of the empire.